For the price of a cup of coffee, join my Patreon. The page includes audio documentaries not available on my YouTube channel. Link below in the description. Thanks for watching. At this time in his life, George Harrison was living in a bungalow named Thorns in Surrey. George had bought the property in 1964, and by 1968 it had been painted psychedelically. Some of the symbols were made by George, others by friends. When Mick Jagger and Marianne Faithfull visited, they painted a message which read, "Mick and Marianne were here and we love you." George had purchased the property on the advice of his accountant. It was the first property he viewed. He later stated, "I thought, that'll do." Outside, George has a heated swimming pool, and from a distance the bungalow looks like the result of an acid trip. Inside, George has no gold discs or souvenirs in sight. The living room contains no chairs whatsoever, just cushions on the floor and very low tables. George can be found sitting on the floor wearing a long white Indian shirt, tuning his sitar. The room is filled with the smoke of a burning incense stick. George states, "I don't personally enjoy being a Beatle anymore. All the meaningless things we do. I'm trying to work out solutions to the more important things in life." George then talks about his beliefs, which include reincarnation along with many Hindu theories. In the kitchen, his wife Pattie Boyd and her sister stand dressed in Apple boutique clothing. A cleaner is employed to take care of the house, and she often joins them for meals which Pattie always cooks. Pattie buys the food herself at a local supermarket. Her latest purchase, a bar of chocolate, she says tastes like a bar of soap. The chocolate is taken back with a letter of complaint in hopes of a few free bars in compensation. Of all the Beatles, George has changed the most. At one time, fans viewed him as the most handsome of all the group. Now, due to his unruly long hair and moustache, he's the least desirable. George is now the most independent of the four and relies least on the band of any of the Beatles. He is, of all the Beatles, the most short-tempered. One time on a train to Wales, he was getting irate with fans requesting autographs while he was trying to drink a cup of tea. The other Beatles weren't so bothered about the pushy fans and continuously told George to relax. George is also the most private and hates unsolicited publicity. Anything that gets out in the papers about his life makes him furious. His wife Pattie still isn't used to the fame that comes with being married to a Beatle. Fans hang around the outside property, in the garden, and even sometimes in the house. She tells of a fan who once broke in and stole some of her and George's clothes. Pattie was even attacked while attending a Beatles concert in 1965. She'd worn her hair back so as not to be recognised. It didn't work. A group of hysterical 13-year-old female fans punched and kicked her while screaming. Pattie punched one back in the face and left. Pattie states she still fears large groups of girls in the street and would cross the road should she ever encounter one. She goes on to say not only strangers but close friends have turned against her. They'd say things like, "It's alright for you, you can afford it." George's time is preoccupied with many hobbies, and everything he takes up he does obsessively. When he first started playing the guitar, he did it until his fingers bled. At this time he plays the sitar for hours on end, sometimes all day. He reads endless amounts of books on religion, and he's never missed a day of meditation since he started. George's songs, unlike John and Paul's, are written alone. His first song, Don't Bother Me, was written while he was ill in a Bournemouth hotel. George stated, "It was a fairly crappy song." Though this is not uncommon, George downplays all of his songs. After writing Don't Bother Me, George didn't write another song for 2 years. He says he began to write more songs after the Beatles stopped touring. His latest songs come from Indian-inspired music. For the songs Within You Without You and Blue Jay Way, he auditioned many musicians who played Indian instruments. Indian instruments not being a common thing studio musicians play at this time in 1968. George even states that some of them weren't good enough, but he used them anyway. On his songwriting, he says, "The words are always a bit of a hang-up for me. I'm not very poetic. My lyrics are really poor, but I don't take any of it seriously." He also states, "I've got no vocal range, so I've got to keep all of my songs simple." Some believe the laughter at the end of George's track Within You Without You was added by the other members of the group, mocking George's taste in Indian music. But it was actually George who added it. He gave 2 reasons. 1, to lighten the mood, and 2, to remind everyone there's an audience listening to Sgt. Pepper's show. The sessions for George's songs take much longer than that of John and Paul's. George by this point could write Indian music notation. Not even George Martin can understand it. George sits in his living room and talks about the differences between Indian and Western song notation. On George's shelf are notebooks full of Indian music for him to practice, his teacher being Ravi Shankar. Tape recordings of Ravi giving George exercises to practice are played throughout the day and even at meal times. Even with all this dedication, George says it will take him years before he's any good. George's day is so consumed with tasks, he often writes his Beatles songs in a rush. Earlier this year, George began writing his first movie soundtrack for the film Wonderwall. Fans at this time often write into the Beatles monthly magazine asking why John and Paul won't let George sing more. George responds to this, saying, "It's not true they don't let me. I would if I wanted to. I just can't be bothered." George feels John and Paul are so good that unless he has something amazing down, why bother? George then critiques his own music, stating, "I don't like what I've done so far. I always seem to be rushed. I see things afterwards I should have done." George then talks about his interest of doing some sort of charitable event, but worries it would be publicised all wrong and spoil everything. He states, "It always does." His interest in Indian culture has been criticised by the press as a passing phase. Despite this, he remains adamant his interest in all things spiritual will last forever. George states, "The cynics will be proved wrong." George then changes the subject to the Beatles' latest film Magical Mystery Tour, which was slated by many. He states, "After films we'll try something new. I don't know what." He ends the conversation optimistic for the future with no more thoughts of the past. For now, George is all consumed with learning the sitar, transcendental meditation, and living a more simplistic but fuller life. Despite his conversion to India, George is still a Beatle. This is his job. He happily notes it pays well and he gets to work with his 3 best friends.